Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. At the time of the sleepover, it was me and my best friend, both aged 7 or 8. We are both now 16 and 17, and haven't talked about this incident since. We lived in Florida, about 15 minutes away from Tampa. It was one of our many sleepovers, and it was no different from the others. We played with Barbies, watched movies, and read books until we couldn't take it anymore, and went to bed around 9 or 10. I turned off the lights and climbed up to my top bunk, where both my friend and I were going to sleep. As I laid down, something immediately didn't feel right. The house I lived in was relatively old, and our landlord sucked and never came to fix anything, let alone did he only care when our rent was due. Before getting in bed, I flipped on my fan and had my mom turn the AC down. But as I got in bed, my fan was turned off. So was the AC. But I thought the power went out and didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes went by, and I couldn't sleep, feeling like I was dying of heat stroke. I wasn't sure if my friend was awake, so I said her name quietly. She responded immediately saying, "I can't sleep, but it's not because it's hot." I looked over and could barely see her silhouette. I looked up at the ceiling and sighed, asking, "What is it then?" She responded, saying, "It's the man in the corner." When I say I got chills, I got chills. I looked over at her slowly, and then turned my head to look at the corner. I thought she was lying because I didn't see anything. I let out a breath of air I didn't know I was holding in. I went to adjust my blanket, and that's when I saw him. A man, dark and tall, seemingly staring at both of us. I immediately gripped my friend's hand and closed my eyes tightly. "We have to get my mom," I whispered, and I felt my friend nod. But we both lay there, unable to move. All of a sudden, I felt the movement of someone climbing up the ladder and crawling slowly. The blankets moved with the movement, and I slowly opened my eyes to watch the man slowly starting to crawl towards us. I was gasping for air and looked over to see my friend watching too, paralyzed from moving. I looked back at the man and could only see his outline. No features. I held my friend's hand tightly and said, "Scream when I tap your finger," barely getting the words out in a whisper. She slowly nodded, and as I watched the man slowly reach for my face, I tapped her hand, and we both screamed bloody murder. My mom came running in, no later than 20 seconds, and turned on the light. Both my friend and I were holding each other, crying. There was no trace of the man, and my mom checked all doors, saying they were locked and weren't even touched. We both slept on the couch that night, watching Barbie movies and holding each other tightly. To this day, I don't know what it was or who it was, but I will always remember the eerie feeling of death being close to my face. Story 2. There is a place near my village that I am too afraid to visit at night. They say Old Monastery Pool is haunted, and that this is the story which proves it. Just after the Second World War, and with rationing still firmly in place, trading any extra food you grew or caught was near necessity. A youth in my tiny Nottinghamshire village, known only as Young Charlie, understood this well. Back in those days, young Charlie could often be found in the Barrel Arms. I actually live there now, trading the trout and eels he'd plucked from local streams for ration stamps. "I suppose you know about Old Monastery Pool?" one patron asked, as he exchanged a few stamps for one of Charlie's slender trout. Charlie shook his head. "Never heard of it, sir. Plenty of big fish in Old Monastery Pool, lad," the patron continued. "Used to be the Monk's Carp Pond. They reared 'em for food hundreds of years ago. It's up in Glover's Wood. Trees moved in once the monastery was gone, but the pond's still there." Charlie's interest was piqued. "Really? Have you ever fished there?" Charlie asked. Me? Nah. You need Alsop's permission else. It's poaching, and me and him don't get on. Mr. Alsop was a local landowner, Charlie knew. But whilst Mr. Alsop apparently had grievance with this man, Charlie had never got on the wrong side of him. How come you know there's plenty of fish if you've never fished there? Must be, answered the patron after a long swig of ale. Else, why'd Alsop have refused all the folk who have asked to fish it? He's keeping all the carp for himself. Miserable booger. The next Sunday morning, there was only one thing on young Charlie's mind. Church was the only place he ever saw Mr. Alsop, and so that was where he'd get his permission. Old Monastery Pool was full of ancient, monster carp, and Charlie was desperate to catch one. Mr. Alsop, Charlie asked after the service, is it true that there's an old carp pond up in your woods? True enough, young man, Mr. Alsop answered as they walked up the narrow church path. It belonged to the old monastery before it was burned down. Why do you ask? I was wondering if I might have your permission to fish it. Sir, I'd return any fish I caught, of course, unless you wanted me to bring them down to the manor. I don't think so, Mr. Alsop answered dismissively. Now, I'd best be off. Lots to do. Charlie was devastated. Fishing was his life. But he'd never had the chance to land anything truly remarkable before. A monster carp would be his crowning achievement and would have the pub talking for years. The next Sunday, Charlie beseeched Mr. Alsop again, but got the same answer. So he tried again the following Sunday, and was still refused. The Sunday after that, he offered to do odd jobs around the manor to pay for his fishing. The Sunday after that, he offered all the trout and eels he caught for a month. But, still, Mr. Alsop would not relent. Charlie tried and tried, Sunday after Sunday, never giving up. Eventually, he started calling in on Mr. Alsop at the manor itself. Lord, not you again, Mr. Alsop moaned when Charlie visited the manor for the third time in as many days. I'm just desperate to fish Old Monastery Pool, Charlie said, before Mr. Alsop had the chance to usher him away. Please, just say yes, and I'll stop coming here. I'll never ask anything of you again. I promise. The answer is no. I've told. Why won't you let me? Charlie exclaimed. Why are you being such a grouch? Because of the abbot, Mr. Alsop barked back. When he refused starving villagers carp after a failed harvest, they strangled him and burned down the monastery to try and cover up the murder. He's still. I don't care about some dead old abbot, Charlie interrupted. I just want one chance to fish the pond. Please. Mr. Alsop, please. Fine, Mr. Alsop answered, throwing his hands in the air. But don't come crying to me, Win. But Charlie didn't hear the end of what Mr. Alsop had to say, because he was already running back towards his house. As soon as he had his fishing tackle, young Charlie raced across the local fields towards Glover's Wood. What he found in the dying light disappointed him. The pond was easy enough to find, but it was clogged with pondweed and full of dead branches. Only a few patches of clear water remained, and Charlie thought he could see through them right to the bottom. It seemed that the water was only a few inches deep, hardly the sort of place that might harbor a monster fish. But he had come this far. Charlie chucked out a little stick float and worm, hoping that there might still be a few minnows around, maybe even an eel or two. Almost as soon as his float stood straight in the water, it was yanked under with all the ferocity of a colossal pike strike. Charlie's line snapped instantly, but he didn't care. There was obviously something huge lurking in the pond. Maybe there was deeper water below the weed after all. The perfect hiding place for the giant carp he'd hoped would be there all along. Charlie wound in his loose line, sank back against a tree, reached into his basket, and began switching to his most robust tackle. But in his eagerness, he couldn't resist a glance back up at the pond. Standing on the other side of the bank amongst the trees, the sinister shape of an old man dressed in tattered, soot-stained robes. He said nothing. He just stared at Charlie through unforgiving, bloodshot eyes. Terrified, Young Charlie shot up from where he was sitting and slammed his head straight into a low branch, knocking himself out. Night engulfed young Charlie when he came around. He remembered where he was, what had happened, and his heart racing, sat straight to squint through the gloom. No sign of any old man, but to his horror, the fishing tackle by his side was smashed to pieces. Young Charlie stood and ran without retrieving so much as a broken float. The above is a story that is endlessly passed around campfires where I grew up. Most of my local ponds are inhabited by mirror carp and, apparently, they're all descended from carp the monks used to rear in their monastery pond, hundreds of years ago. According to local legend, the monastery was burned down when a cruel abbot refused fish to starving villagers after a failed harvest. In doing so, the abbot brought death and a terrible curse upon himself. Now he's doomed to patrol old monastery pool day and night, making sure no villagers try to take his precious fish. This picture is of the Burrell Arms back in its heyday. Last orders was 1952, as well as an old snap of me with a local monastery, descended mirror carp. I have once visited old monastery pool in the daytime, and I can report that it is weedy, murky, and surrounded by twisted trees and thorny undergrowth. It is certainly an eerie, unsettling place. I don't mind admitting that I was too creeped out by the pool to stay for very long. On top of that, I've always been too scared to visit at night or to throw in a fishing line like young Charlie did. In fact, I don't know of anyone in the village who's ever fished the pond or been up there at night. Story 3. Everyone's eyes are missing from their faces. What do you mean by that? I asked her calmly, making note of her body language. Each time my patient spoke, she avoided eye contact entirely. She'd dart her eyes around, as if scared to land on one thing for too long. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her left knee bounced rhythmically. "There's nothing there," she murmured. "Mind in a different place, where the eyes should be." "Can you describe it more in length?" I asked. She paused before speaking again. "They still have noses, and mouths, and eyebrows, I guess, but there's no eyes. It's just..." "I see. I wrote that down. How long have you been seeing this?" She shrugged, fidgety as ever. "Does it frighten you?" "Sometimes," she replied, now looking to the floor. "Is that why you don't want to look at me?" I began. She tensed her shoulders, so I added, "You don't have to. I'm just curious." "I don't know." She spoke quietly. "It's all right. I won't make you do anything you're not comfortable with." I tapped the notepad lightly with my pen, coming up with some other questions. I wondered to myself if this was a side effect of an underlying condition, manifesting into a reality. How about pictures? Or mirrors? Do people still look funny there? "It's not funny," she said bluntly, then immediately shrunk back into herself as if expecting discipline. "I'm sorry, Bren," I conceded. "I only mean, do they still not have eyes when you're not looking directly at them?" "Yes," she nodded, "but it's worse." "Do you mind telling me how so?" I tried to be as inoffensive as I could with my words and tone. The more I knew, the better understanding I had of what she was experiencing. But I also knew not to probe too much, or I lose the chance of hearing more. Some patients require lots of patience and security, and I had no problem obliging. So far, Bryn had shared with me far more than she has in our previous sessions, and I wanted to see more into her world, get an idea as to why she had done what she did, leading to her school expulsion. Their entire face is wrong. Bryn began to explain, struggling with which words to choose. They're warped and stretched and confusing to look at. The longer I stare, the more it changes into something worse, until I can't look anymore and have to shield my eyes. "That sounds quite unpleasant," I frowned. "You said this is only in pictures and mirrors?" "Yes. For now." She breathed with a shudder. "For now? Sometimes I see the faces in the real world too, in the sides of my vision, and if I look at it, it goes away, but I don't think that will last for long." I sighed. I felt deeply sympathetic for her. She seemed to be battling against demons created by her mind, fueled by anxiety and stress. I tried to piece together what she told me with what I knew, and the main reason the state had hired me to help her in the first place. Even her own parents cowered before her, relieved as soon as she stepped out of their car in my driveway. It sickened me. They deny her love and support in these trying times. But I was only seeing one perspective. Bryn has yet to deliberate any issues with her family. Were you experiencing this when you attacked that girl in April? I said slowly, hoping to reintegrate the incident in her mind as unobtrusively as possible. If you don't want to talk about it, I understand. That wasn't a girl, Bryn pleaded, finally looking towards me. She paused for a fraction of a second before snapping her head away, terrified. It was one of them disguised as her. I swear. I would never hurt someone like that unless I had to. Okay, I bit my lip, glancing at my files. So you believe that you were in danger? She was stronger than the others. She didn't answer my question, but I chose to momentarily lean into that comment. The others, as in the faces, I clarified. Yes, you perceive them as other people. Not just strange faces, but separate entities. I knew I should avoid putting words in her mouth, as it was best to let her come to her own conclusions. But I couldn't help myself. A part of me was morbidly curious, trying to accept how a child could brutally maim another child with nothing but a rock in her bare hands. The pictures provided from that day were visceral and disturbing. Bryn so far seems troubled, but not to this degree. Not to the degree of severe institutionalization, as the court suggested. Yeah, her face melted with relief, tears welling on her lower lashes. They're not human. Just shadows or glitches, but they follow me everywhere. And that girl, she wanted to hurt me. She told me awful things, and then the tears fell as she dissolved into sobs. I reached for my tissue box and handed it to her, allowing her to get it out of her system. You are very brave for telling me all this, I started. She had her face buried in her palms, hiccuping. We can be done for today if it's too much. It's fine, she choked. I just need a minute. Take all the time you need. I leaned back and glanced around the room. Eyes flickering over the mirror hung on the wall behind the sofa, and the reflection was myself, my desk to the right, the window to the left spilling light from the afternoon. And then I saw it. Like a speck or an illusion, there was a second face over my own. One with a twisted grin, hollow eyes, pupils swelled in the sclera. I shut my eyelids and shook my head. I didn't even need to convince myself I was seeing things. I already felt so confidently I had. I opened them and saw it again, but much closer. Face pressed against the other side of the mirror like it was a window. I jumped, startled, and Bryn snapped her head up. Sorry, I laughed. Just had a sudden chill. I'm not sure she could tell if I was lying, but regardless, she didn't push it. We concluded our session on a high note, talking about how proud I was of her progress. As soon as she left my office, I removed the mirror from the wall and stashed it into a closet. Then, I made a call. Hello. Bryn's mother answered, voice etched in trepidation. Hi, Mrs. Barker, I began. I'm calling about Bryn's progress so far in my sessions. Oh, Mrs. Barker was timid and sheepish, speaking at a barely audible murmur. Really well, I replied. But before my next session with her, I wanted to see if I could have you and your husband come in. I want to get your perspective. If that's all right, just us. For a session, yes. She paused. That's fine, she answered. We scheduled a time, and I hung up with an exhale. When Mr. and Mrs. Barker arrived, I showed them to my office and had them choose their own seats. They sat on the sofa, a person's length between them. I asked then how they were, offered them some bottled water. They were very uncomfortable in each other's presence as well as my own, displaying a clear lack of trust. I wondered how long they'd been like this, if it had anything to do with Bryn's behavior. How long have you been together? I began, wanting to see their reaction. Subtle facial expressions and body language would notify me whether or not the subject of their relationship was one of merriment or tension. 10 years, Mr. Barker replied, seemingly neutral about the topic. Married 2 years before Bryn was born. That's lovely, I added. My husband and I are coming up on our 6th year this June. Congratulations. Mrs. Barker smiled meekly. Do you have kids of your own? The husband asked. No, we don't plan on having children, I replied. But we do have plenty of pets. That's nice. He nodded. Is it just you three at home? I crossed my legs. Any pets of your own? We had a cat once. Mrs. Barker fidgeted with her nails, picking at her cuticles. That was a while ago. I figured this was enough preamble before diving into the meat of the conversation. Bryn seems quite lonely, I said. Maybe another pet could help her if you're open to the idea. We can't trust her with pets anymore, Mr. Barker stated. That piqued my interest. Do you mind telling me why? He pondered, then shook his head. Well, I won't force your hand, of course, I began. But this is a safe space. The more you share with me, the better I can help Bryn. He sighed, then sunk further into the sofa. Bryn was an infant when we had the cat. He shared. He was an older family cat from my late mother. One day, we heard Bryn crying from her crib. Julie went to check on her. He glanced over to his wife, and she found him in pieces. Pieces. He was strewn about like he had been mauled, Julie answered. It was horrifying. Do you think it might have been an intruder? A stray dog that may have wandered in your home? I asked. No, that's not possible. At the time, we lived in an apartment, 5th story, the husband said. It wasn't a large space. We would have heard someone enter. When you saw the cat in the state he was in, I thought aloud. What was going through your mind? I'm sorry, but I want to move on. Julie looked distressed, so I dropped the subject. Anything else peculiar with Bryn? She's told me some troubling things that she's seen as of late. The angels. Julie raised both her brows. She saw my confusion and blushed. Sorry, don't be. I studied her. Angels was an interesting choice of words. I would have understood entities, ghosts, maybe glitches. But angels was very specific. Has she called them angels? No. The husband's face morphed into a scowl. Julie insists on calling them that. She shot him an apprehensive glare. So, regardless, I continued. How long has she been talking about these? The husband looked to his wife, expecting her to answer. She did the same to him. Both had some kind of silent communication between the two of them, and Julie sighed. We really wanted to have a baby. Hardened. Kent and I had gotten married and wanted to have a child, Julie clarified. I got pregnant with a girl. This wasn't what I had initially asked, but I sat back and let her continue. 5 months into pregnancy, I suffered a miscarriage. It was devastating. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was living a waking nightmare, and I wanted it to end. Then, one day, I was at the store and I ran across an older-looking woman. She approached me and said she was sorry for my loss. I don't know how she knew, and at first I was angry, telling her to screw off and leave me alone. But then she offered to help me. I was about to pass her off as crazy, but she handed me a card and told me to call her when I was ready. I wanted to throw that card away so badly, but I couldn't. I didn't know who this woman was, but on the card she listed herself as a fertility witch. Sounded made up, but I was beside myself with grief. So I went anyway and took Kent with me. He tried to talk me out of it, but I just needed to, get the curiosity out of my system. Her office was the very definition of what you'd expect. Kent added, shrunken heads, animal bones, dried herbs, crystals. The woman beckoned Julie to lay down and offered to perform a ritual for free. We were uncomfortable and declined. But the woman said something that rattled us. She said the name of our baby, and there was no way she would have known. We had wanted the name to be a surprise, so only my wife and I knew. This should have been what sent us on our way, but Julie and I felt some kind of deeper connection. This woman seemed to be legit, and we allowed her to do the ritual. And then I was pregnant again, Julie said, as if we got a second chance. Bryn was back inside me, developing as a beautiful, healthy baby. We delivered her with ease. We couldn't have been happier. And then the angels appeared. Kent's brows furrowed, his expression turning grim. They followed Bryn everywhere, and by proxy began to haunt the people nearest her. We saw them in the dark corners of our house, the alleyways of downtown, in the reflections of the mirrors and car windows and water in the tub. We also tried to ignore them, but each birthday Bryn had, the angels would do something drastic, as if lashing out against us before fading back into distant apparitions. The death of our cat was one such instance. Julie added, "The others I don't wish to speak of, but they are similar." She'd turn another year older. The angels would do something bad, and then cease to be an issue until next year. They never worsened in severity, so we falsely assumed we could manage. Prepare for what would happen and deal with it. So, I finally broke the silence, unsure of how to process this information. This instance with Bryn attacking her schoolmate. Is it birthday related? No. Julie broke into nervous tears. That's why we're so scared. It's almost like it's corrupting her now. Kent held his wife's hand and gave it a singular squeeze before letting go. It's starting to bleed into everyday life, and we're at our wits' end. I looked at them for a moment before coming up with a response. "I'm sorry, but I find this incredibly hard to believe," I began. I know. Kent looked pleading. "I know how crazy it sounds, but that's why we're telling you. You're a professional child psychologist, not a psychic or paranormal nutcase. You aren't going to take my words to heart because it sounds ridiculous, but Bryn has opened up to you. She trusts you, whereas any help we've tried to get from the church or elsewhere has just made things worse. Every day it gets harder and harder not to be afraid." Julie continued to cry. "It's ruining our relationship with Bryn and each other. We just want to know how to help her." That night, I was tossing and turning, unable to get any rest. I was hoping to get some clarity from Bryn's parents, but what Julie and Kent shared with me only added to the confusion. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really. But the Barkers were fully convinced that Bryn was being haunted by entities that were slowly beginning to influence her. And yet, I've seen movies with similar plots. The brief visage of said entity in my office mirror wasn't enough proof to validate any of this as true. So were they making this up? Why? What benefit would the Barkers have in telling me this tale of demons and witches when their child's very well-being was at stake? I was the one who the state hired to see whether or not Bryn needed juvenile psychiatric treatment. She had hurt another student to the point of irreversible damage. The only reason she wasn't behind bars was because she was 8. So didn't Kent and Julie see how serious this was? I dissented these questions to my husband, leaving out names and specific details as per protocol. Though if you're reading this now, that got thrown out the window. He agreed with what I said, but also suggested I request documentation of Bryn's birth if I was able to. Try to see if she really had been born again. I wasn't too keen at first with the idea, but decided it could be beneficial in helping Bryn by rooting out what was and wasn't the truth. The documents, to my surprise, were granted. There was her birth certificate, a miscarriage certification from the state months prior, copies of tests from both times. Julie was first reported to be pregnant. The time frame in between the miscarriage certification to the birth of Bryn was strangely short. Only 4 months separated the two dates, which perplexed me. I knew I was beginning to tread upon territory outside my pay grade, but I was too invested. I reached out to the doctor that signed off on both documents, hoping maybe I could get some answers. "Hello." The woman on the phone picked up after the third ring. "Yes. Hi, my name is Dr. Gray, and I'm calling about one of your previous patients, Bryn Barker." The woman paused. and you're supposed to be. Her psychologist, I replied, trying to find a way to justify my calling. I've been asked by the state to begin treatment for her, but I've noticed a discrepancy in her forms of identification. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Despite her no longer being my patient, I have a confidentiality agreement. My hopes fell. Okay, I understand. That. But I no longer work for that hospital anyways, she continued. So said agreement must no longer apply, right? Not sure that's how it works, but we'll roll with it. Well, I would love it if you could perhaps stop by my office. Again, another interruption. Let's meet somewhere else. Keep it on the down low. I understand. That evening, I met up with her at a local sports bar. I found her sitting alone at a booth, drinking a beer and staring intently at her phone. I introduced myself and we shook hands before I sat. And then, after I explained to her what the Barkers had told me, she shared her side of the story. It's not unheard of for a woman to be pregnant soon after the gestation period of her previous miscarriage. If she was ovulating, she could be pregnant with another baby within the week. But according to the woman, Julie had shown back in her office a month later, 6 months pregnant. That was medically impossible. She tried to run more tests, consult other doctors, but the higher-ups ended up saying that she had made a mistake prior. But she hadn't. Undoubtedly, the fetus hadn't survived in Julie's womb. The woman even had a prognosis for the miscarriage, a cervical insufficiency. Despite this, Bryn was born healthy, and it seemed the matter would get swept under the rug. Then I was approached by an older lady. She continued. This lady wasted no time telling me that she had performed a ritual on Julie in order to allow her to be pregnant, but it appeared to have backfired. Rather than have a new child, Julie's womb appears to have reanimated her deceased child, which, in the lady's words, borders on necromancy. The woman shook her head. I was taken aback by the absurdity of these claims, but she told me to quit my practice at once. There are these angels that try to settle the score of death. If someone comes back to life, they intervene. I guess they can't take back the life directly, but they will take the lives of others until the scales are balanced. It's not as easy as an eye for eye. These angels will wreak all kinds of havoc and curse any who seek to get in their way, which is why she advised I quit my job, for it would have unintended consequences thereon, and so I ignored her outright. She looked to her hands, appearing guilty. It took the stillbirth of my next 2 patients for me to finally understand. Any woman I saw, I'd inevitably doomed to suffer the loss of her child. I tried to get in contact with some of the other staff surrounding Bryn's birth. Some of them killed themselves. Some others went insane. Vanished without a trace. Then she turned to me with a look of urgency on her face. Dr. Gray, I know it's your job to help. Believe me, but Bryn cannot be saved, and you'll damn yourself the more you try to interfere. If I were you, I'd tell the state she needs to be put away for the safety of herself and everyone around her. I was disgusted by her reply. So much so, I stood without a single word and left the bar in a hurry. I got to my car and sat, gripping the steering wheel. After calming myself down with some deep breaths, I looked up and saw a fucked up version of Bryn behind me, reaching over with speed to grab onto my neck and strangle me. I struggled for breath and I tried to fight her off me, but it was unrelenting. I reached for my keys and stabbed one of them onto its arm, and it recoiled long enough for me to catch some air. I threw myself out of the car and fell onto the pavement, scrambling away. I turned back and saw my car was empty. I had merely stabbed my keys into the foam of my seat. Now I sit at home, after having worked up the courage to re-enter my car. I have another meeting with Bryn tomorrow, but given all I know and all I've seen, I'm not sure what to do. I don't want to abandon a child in need. It goes against everything I stand for as a person, but I'm not sure I have what it takes to give Bryn the help she needs. Even now, my husband is making dinner in the kitchen behind me. I have to turn my back against him because every time I see him from the corner of my eye, I notice his eyes are missing from his face.